Okay, let's make a start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yusuf. I'm the BRC Academic Capacity Development Emerging Lead, working with my colleague, Dr. Carol Burnett, and also Professor Anne Henry, who are both the ACD leads, as well as the Academic Capacity Development Committee. So today, we are privileged to have a interesting talks and interesting topic as well pertaining to research inclusion. And just letting you know that initially the plan was to have three speakers. Unfortunately, Hanif Ismail wasn't able to join us due to personal reasons. But we still have Amy Rebane and also Sharanjit Boughan from the BRC. So they both will be talking about embedding PPIEP into research and also inclusivity as a condition of funding and best practice. So just a few house rules. So as you may be aware, so this session is now recorded. And everyone has been muted automatically to avoid the noise during presentation. So if you do have any questions pertaining to the talks, and we do encourage interactive participation, if you can put it on the chat at the end of both talks presentation, we will go through them all, and also we may be able to give you opportunity to present the question yourself as well. So just before we start with that, I'm just going to share a few things. So this is our survey. So basically, I'm just sharing you the QR code for today. So in terms of the talk itself, once the talk finish, if you could kindly do fill in this 3 to 5 minute survey, that will be really helpful for us to improve our session. The next one, I will also put this slide again at the end of the presentation, and also after the talk and the presentation, for those who are not be able to have your mobile with you currently, we will send you emails as well. Just to let you know some of the save the dates as well for the next lots. So that will be pertaining to funding opportunities. So Tuesday, 4th March. And also the next after that, tips on successful grant writing will be Wednesday, 19th of March. So put, save the dates, but we will send some adverts around, February time. But I thought we just need to put in your calendar as well. All right. Okay. So now I'm going to stop sharing this. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Amy Rebane, who's our lead PPIEP at BRC, Leeds BRC. And she'll be enlightening us about embedding PPIEP into research. Amy?
Thank you very much, Yaz. And thanks to you and Carol for having us here this afternoon, and thanks everybody for being here. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout. So my name is Amy Rebane. I'm the Patient and Public Involvement, Engagement and Participation Lead for the Biomedical Research Centre, and I'm here with my colleague Sharanjit. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Sharanjit and I'm the Community PPIEP Coordinator working with Amy's team at the Biomedical Research Centre.
Thanks, Sharanjit. So I'm just going to talk about acronyms really quickly. You might notice we've got an excessively long acronym of PPIEP. Realistically, I'm probably just going to say PPI whilst I'm presenting, and that will hopefully become clear as we go through. So I'm going to get the presentation rolling. And okay, Sharanjit, can you see that okay? Is that full screen on your window? Perfect, excellent. So we've just gone through introductions and I've explained the acronyms. So just to go through what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to kickstart by talking about involvement, engagement and participation. Then we'll move on to the importance of PPI, how you can do it at different points of the research cycle and some activities. And then we'll move on to talk about underserved groups, research inclusion, and then the Leeds principles for engaging communities in research. And then at the end of the presentation, we've got a whole heap of contact details and everything like that for you. So what we can do is we can make sure these slides are shared with you. So you've got all those details, and you've also got any of the hyperlinks for guidance that are included in today's agenda. So let's start off with definitions. So we've got that big long acronym of PPIEP. So let's talk about each of those. So we've got engagement. So engagement is typically where information about research is provided and dissemination. We then got involvement. So that is where members of the public and patients are actively engaged in shaping research projects. And then we've got participation, which is where people take part in a research study. So those are sort of the three different elements. And I think it's important to acknowledge at this point, we will talk about people, we will talk about patients, we'll talk about public, we'll talk about carers. So it can be a whole host of different people that are involved in research, and ultimately that is because it's relevant to them. So let's go into a little bit more detail about what exactly patient and public involvement is. So the NIHR, our largest funder for research here, defines it as research carried out with and by members of the public rather than to, about, or for them. So that's a really important definition. That sort of means that you are working in partnership with members of the public and you are working together to develop research, as opposed to doing research without their inclusion at all. And basically it comes back to people being actively engaged in shaping and developing research projects. So we've got the hyperlink for the NIHR guidance, which gives you a bit more information about that. So I think one of the things that's really important to talk about is the distinction between PPI and participation, because I think more and more over recent years, we've seen a bit of confusion about that. And it seems to be particularly when people are using qualitative methods. And it's really important to have clarity on that distinction due to the ethical approval process. So I suggest if you are sort of a bit confused about that distinction, about whether your activity is PPI or participation, you sort of just take a step back and you look at it and you think about what's the role and the impact of this person's involvement, and also how am I going to go about this activity and approach people. So if we look at the two different definitions in this context, you've got participation. So participation is people taking part in the study, and they're consented to take part in the study as part of a research plan. And the impact of that is you're going to have a person who's recruited and consented to study specific activity. That might be a focus group, it might be an interview, it might be where they participate in an intervention and take a drug. But ultimately, their number is counted to your final total of participants for that particular activity and the overall findings. Now, when we look at involvement, it's really important to then think about this focuses on people having an active role in shaping, developing and delivering the study. So they might not be consented in the same way as participants, and this activity would be included in part of the PPI plan for the study as opposed to the research plan. And generally the impact for that is going to be it influences part of the study design, development and delivery. So I think if you're ever finding yourself at a point where you're not sure about this, just take that step back and ask these and go through these questions with yourself. So there's a lot of different reasons why PPI is important. And here's just a couple of them. So, quite crudely, policy is really important in policy. The expectation from the NIHR is they want to see how people have contributed to developing the research and how they will continue to contribute to the research once it's funded. There is a moral obligation there because, ultimately research impacts on people's lives. And it's important to people to be involved in decisions which may impact their lives. And also, if we're thinking about doing research for people and working with people, we need to think, I suppose, of democratically, a lot of research is funded by the public. And then thinking about the actual impacts on research. So there is research out there that does talk about how research which has been created with PPI from the outset, throughout and afterwards, generally is more successful. And there's a lot of different points which this can impact on. So thinking about relevance, recruitment, retention, and impact, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. And another important factor of this as well is when you involve patients and the public in research activity, they might see factors that you might overlook because they've got that lived experience in the area, and you might have that clinical experience or that learnt experience, etc. But also there's a big role for lived experience and how it impacts on day-to-day life. And we hear from a lot of people that are involved in PPI that it can be a rewarding and empowering experience for them. So sometimes you'll have people put in PPI activity that they've done into their CVs. It might make them feel a bit more empowered when it comes to their condition because they know more about it. And there's also that peer support element that comes from activity where people might be living with conditions and they're meeting people who are also living with those conditions. So there's a lot of different reasons there why PPI is important, sort of going from the fact that, you know, policy says we need to be doing it, right through to how it improves that research and the lives of people involved. So input can take lots of different forms throughout the research life cycle, right through from identifying and prioritising topics, so when you're doing your research development and design, through to dissemination and evaluation, so when you're sort of sharing your research findings and you're evaluating the success of your research. And I think crucial points that they can help with are sort of around research, the relevance, the feasibility of the research that you're doing, the impact from a lived experience perspective, and also some of the risk versus benefit factors that people might be weighing up when they make a decision about whether they want to participate in the research. So if we just look at these different factors one by one as we work through the research cycle. So identifying and prioritising topics. So they can identify priorities for research that are based upon their lived experience. So you might have a research question and you might have a couple of things that you want to find in that research question. And by speaking with people about that who've got lived experience in that area, they'll be able to help you develop that research question. They might help you refine it. They might suggest taking elements away from it to ultimately say, this would be really impactful for my day-to-day life. And it might not be for them personally in their life cycle, but it might be for those who come after them living with that condition. When it comes to commissioning, so there's sort of the ways that are quite typical that we hear a lot about, where people might include co-applicants and helping co-produce a project proposal. And I think one of the things that's really important with that is that it's important to make sure that's meaningful if you are going to be doing that, and you've got sort of clear outcomes which come with that and aims that you'd like to achieve by doing that. We also see PPI representatives sat on funding panels. And from my experience of being sat with them, you will tend to get those questions about patient benefit and asking about your PPI, because those are things that they're really interested in. Move on to designing the study. So this is really important because they can help a lot with feasibility. So you might have a suggestion where you're going to say, right, we are going to get everybody in and they will do an MRI and then they're going to do an ultrasound, and all these people are living with a musculoskeletal condition. If you're speaking to people with musculoskeletal condition, they might be like, oh, that's quite intensive. How long am I going to have to stay still for in the MRI scan? Can I have a break and a brew between going from my MRI scan to my ultrasound? Like this it might feel relatively straightforward and it fits well with what you're planning to do, but speaking to patients can help you sort of iron out some of those things and make it more likely for people to participate in them. When it comes to managing and undertaking the research, this is where we see often patient advisory groups or networks set up, and Sharanjit will speak more about the patient advisory network approach and how that offers a bit more flexibility. But this is basically giving people updates about the research activity that you're doing. It's about asking them for feedback on certain areas where you might be hitting some snagging points. It might be specific activities relating to your work packages. So there's a lot of different ways that people can be involved in that particular stage. In recruitment and collecting data, you might have people who are peer recruiters. So, you know, you might be recruiting to a really large study. So you want to get some patients trained up who can help with that as well. It's unlikely that they'll be consenting people, but they can still help with that recruitment and sort of like almost breaking the ice with people because they've got that shared experience. Analysis and interpretation of data is you might have reams and reams of quantitative data, and sometimes it can be helpful to look at that with people with lived experience in that area to sort of offer that side of interpretation that you might not necessarily see, but they see clearly because they can relate to that and they understand why that might be happening for people. And dissemination and evaluation is really important because if you are wanting to communicate your findings to a lived experience audience, who better to help you shape that communication than those with lived experience? Because again, they're going to come back to those things that are relevant and meaningful to them and the wider patient community as well. So there are different ways that people can be involved at every single point of the research cycle. And it's in not every piece of research is going to look the same. There are going to be some where it's not relevant at every stage, it's not appropriate, or it's not feasible to do that. So again, it's coming back to why you're going to be doing it. So how's it going to be effective? How's it going to be purposeful? And what's the impact of this going to be as well? And we'd always say in PPI that the earlier you engage with people, the better. Because it means that you've got a greater chance of making it meaningful and successful, and also that you're going to get it right from the outset and you're going to have a clear plan in place as well. And also if you need to flex on that plan, people are more likely to flex with you if they're bought into it from the outset. And another point to highlight as well is that some things will feel like they're behind the scene activities. So your lab work, data sets, a systemic review. But it's still relevant to people with lived experience because the output is still going to affect their patient experience as well. So there's still those questions that can be asked about translating this information, the benefits of it, the relevance as well. But ultimately go with what works, and I would say make it meaningful as well and think about that impact. So when we think about different PPI activities, I think a lot of them, to be honest, we've just covered off in the previous slide, but this is a list of them that you might want to refer back to and think about what's relevant to the work that you're doing. And then I suppose if we move on to some sort of top tips for doing PPI. So if you're going to be doing something, be it online or in person, there's things to think about which will help you create a positive environment. And I think a lot of those are probably based around the third one, which is ground rules. So I always think that's a nice icebreaking activity to almost set your ground rules with the group, because everybody's got shared ownership of it. And things that they might include will be around confidentiality. And this isn't just confidentiality when it comes to not wanting information sharing about your research, but also confidentiality about people's lived experiences as well. It might be sensitivity. So, you know, acknowledging that there might be some triggers for people. If it's going to be particularly sensitive, is there scope for you to have a breakout room? Do you need, even in some extreme cases, a therapist on hand or a place where there are people who have got experience to counsel people in that particular area. Thinking about inclusion, so how can everybody participate equally? How have you got that equity around that table? And that will look different to different people. But again, it's about creating that environment so everybody can participate equally. Active listening, so how you respond to people, how you take their feedback on board. Not everything people share with you is going to be relevant. Some people will just give you their entire life stories as well. Something that you might want to do is create a board where you can jot down things that you might come back to later if they're not necessarily relevant to what you're what you're discussing right there. It might be helpful to have somebody else with you who can act as sort of like a co-chair, which means that they can keep on top of those things when they're wandering, and you can focus on the discussion at hand. Transparency is really important when it comes to managing people's expectations. So there will be some things that you cannot change. You probably can't change a consent form that's 16 pages long because you're doing a very early study about a particular drug. So be honest about that from the outset. If you can't change it, what can you change? Can you change the wraparound information and how that's communicated to people when they're being recruited? And ultimately, mutual respect. So if you want to create a safe environment for people, do you need to enforce that to an extent? And if you do have behaviours from people which aren't necessarily appropriate, which aren't respectful within group environments, you can ask them to leave. You can speak to them after the session. You can go with it and you can do with whatever feels appropriate at that time. But, you know, that's not just about protecting people in the room, but it's about yourself as well as an individual, and sort of thinking about what needs to happen in that situation. So value and involvement is really important, and I think there's two different elements to this. And the first element is sort of about, you know, that monetary valuing. So we're thinking about expenses, we're thinking about recognition payments and refreshments, those things that value it in that way. And there's lots of information on the NIHR web pages about that and the appropriate reimbursement to give, and that really should be going into all grant applications where you have got that PPI budget. And the second side is communication. So being really clear from the outset about why people are getting involved, managing those expectations, making sure people have got information that's personalised to their needs ahead of the meeting so they can take the time to go through it, following up after activity or after the research as well. Like if you know you're going to have a quiet patch of 6 months between activity, you know, maybe at that 3-month point, you just send everybody an email saying this is what you've been working on in the background. It's to keep that ongoing communication going. And it's really important to sort of think of people, patients and the public that you involve in, or caregivers, as equal partners in this as well, and that they have the same opportunities that everybody else does. So what does bad patient-public involvement look like? It's inaccessible. So, you know, generally I would avoid a focus group starting at 9 o'clock in the morning, because that might be accessible for us and perfectly normal for us in our working lives. But if you're a person who requires a lot of medication in the morning, it takes you time to get going. If you've got commitments around family members, children, etc., that might not be so accessible for you. So it's about understanding what people's access needs are, and then accommodating those. Bad PPIs rushed. You know, if you give people a week to respond to something, realistically, you're not treating those people very well. It's not very respectable to ask people who have got lives outside of this activity to respond to something within a week. But also, you're not going to get the best outcome that you can possibly get from that as well. And that's why we do go earlier the better when advising it. There's points about no clarity, so, you know, ambiguous explanations of activity, people not really understanding fully why they're there and what they're getting involved in. Or the flip side of that is leading. So you think my research is a great idea, right? Yeah. You know, like, don't, it's that sort of thing about, like, you know, ask open questions. It might be really obvious that something is a good idea, but let people tell you that it's a good idea and why, and that'll create a much stronger narrative when it comes to your grant application. And then we've got words that we hear a lot about: tick box exercise, tokenistic exercises as well, for the sake of doing it, to say you've done it. And there's no impact beyond that. There's no narrative to that. It's just been done. You've ticked a box. Relying on goodwill. Generally, you shouldn't be relying on people's goodwill. Like, they're giving up their time, and it might be for free, but also don't assume that it is for free for everybody and that everybody is happy to do it for free. I would always go on the side of people would like recognition payments, so I'd like expenses, and individuals can refuse that. That's fine. But just because you might have a group of people who are happy to do it on goodwill doesn't mean that that's the same for everybody, and that should be relied upon. And then going back to the previous slide where we talk about communication, it's no follow-up from people. So we refer to this as parachute PPI. You go into a group, you do an activity, you leave again, they never hear from you again. Like, that's really bad practice. And it's not just bad practice for you, but it's also a bad practice for your institution as well. And what does good PPI look like? Well, basically the opposite. But I think important things to draw up out from this is sort of everybody's expertise is equally recognised. That lived experience expertise is as important as the clinical experience expertise that you have as well. And everybody's got that equitable space in which they can participate in. Okay, so moving on to research inclusion as a condition of funding. So I felt like a complete gear shift there. So what we'll do is, then I can't see the chat, so I don't know if questions have come in regards to the PPI side of things. We will pick up everything together at the end. So the PPI slides are the ones that my colleague Hanif would have been working through. These are the ones that myself and Sharanjit would have been presenting on around research inclusion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about research inclusion as a condition of funding from the NIHR, which I believe they introduced at the back end of November. And then I'm going to hand over to Sharanjit, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about how this looks in practice and best practice for that as well. So just to let you know that there are heaps of links in here about research inclusion as a condition of funding, which you can refer back to. I've just gone through and pulled out the key points which feel like they're the most important ones to share with you today. So really, you need to be thinking about how your research addresses inequalities relevant to your research area, and how your research considers inclusion across the whole research life cycle. So your background and rationale. If you know that the condition area that you're looking into impacts X community more than the wider community, how are you going to make sure that people from the X community are able to participate in this as equally as a member of the wider community? So what things are you going to be put in place for them to do that? And PPI is a really good way of doing this as well, because by working with those people with lived experience, you can get an idea of how to involve people like them in that activity as well. So, and also sort of thinking about your inclusion exclusion criteria, you know, think about that in reference to the different communities that you might want to be engaging with for your research. And it's important that it's considered from the outset and embedded. So a lot of the time, until this requirement came in from the NIHR, it was sort of mainly focused around PPI and how you're going to do inclusive PPI and how that might lead to inclusive research. But now they're looking at things that are wider than that. So, you know, having that awareness of what your communities are, your population group from the outset, where you might need to put that extra work in to make sure you can engage with them and include them. But also, you know, training. So a lot of the time people will put in, like, you know, you might do some qualitative training. You might go and shadow somebody. You might do some PPI training, then EDI training, right? You can include in that as well. And sort of, are there any costings included? So do you need to work with a community group to engage with a particular community? Cost that in. Do you need somebody from your institution who's got expertise within that area? Cost them in as well. So it's sort of really embedded throughout. And one of the things that personally I find really helpful when it comes to thinking about things like this is come back to the aims of your funder. So the NIHR has a mission to reduce inequalities in health, social care and public health. So how is your research going to contribute to reducing those inequalities? How can your research help them become a more inclusive health research funder? And also they've got very specific inclusive research funding guidance. So I would recommend going through that list and just working through each of those points one by one. And I would say team diversity, it's important, it's beneficial, but it's not assessed. But again, when thinking about that, you know, come back to your institution, what do they have in place? So think about the University of Leeds has a research culture policy, strategy, sorry. And also sort of like, how might a diverse team help you with certain activities as well, with the lived experience that they might have. And again, I said that there's a bunch of hyperlinks in here, and these are all the ones that are relevant to research inclusion as a condition of funding. So I believe I'm moving over to Sharanjit. So Sharanjit, let me know when you want me to move on to the next slide for you.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you, everyone. So just following on from Amy talking about PPI and why it's important, I'm just going to do a little bit about the sort of all inclusive agenda and underserved groups and communities that we talk a lot about. So my role within the PPI team is the community PPI coordinator. And I suppose it's to make that link between communities, underserved communities, and the world of research and PPI. And I suppose sort of even as a starting point, the way my role has been established and set up is more inclusive than maybe previously. So even though I work for the BRC, I'm actually based within a community organisation and hosted within there. So I've got access to groups and communities that I need to. And I think that's a really good example of sort of being more inclusive in the approach that we take. And I just think the importance of sort of all the stuff that Amy's talked about, you know, you can do the best PPI in the world and you can have people involved and you can involve them along the way. But if the people that you involve are not diverse and not representative and reflect the populations that you're serving, then you're not achieving what you need to in terms of sort of making real changes and improving the health of those populations. So that's a little bit about why it is so important. So I'm just going to start off. We talk a lot about underserved groups. So this is the terminology that we use, underserved communities, underserved groups, and it's been sort of used quite widely, and NIHR established it, and it was done sort of in partnership with lots of different stakeholders coming together and deciding, actually, this is a terminology that we feel is most appropriate. It's not perfect, it never will be. It's changed massively over the years. We used to have what we called hard to reach communities, seldom heard communities. Some people say underrepresented. I suppose this term is more about actually not putting the onus on those communities and saying they're hard to reach. It's actually the support and services that we provide that are not reaching them. So we're not serving them in the way that we're meant to. And we know that there's lower inclusion in research than one would expect from certain populations. There's a higher healthcare burden that's not matched by the volume of research designed for people belonging to underserved groups and communities. And there's quite important differences in how different groups respond or engage with healthcare interventions compared to other groups. And unfortunately, research has neglected to address some of those factors. So it's that whole one approach or one size fits all type of approach that we know doesn't work with different groups and communities. And some of the key factors when we talk about underserved groups, because sometimes there's an assumption that we're just talking about gender and race, and it's so much more than that. So we have obviously, groups by demographics, which can be age, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all those things. But we also have groups by socioeconomic factors, which can be homeless population, traveller communities, people living in remote areas, carers. It's a huge group, people that can be defined by health status, so physical disabilities, mental health issues, and then we can have disease specific. So it's really hard to just give a list of who we mean. So it's important to kind of really think wider about these groups and these communities when we're talking about underserved groups and communities, and make it relevant to your research. And there's a link on there to the Include framework where all the toolkits and everything that you need to know around this are there. So when we send the slides around, the link, I would say go read up on it. There's some really, really helpful stuff in there. Next slide, please, Amy. Thanks. So yeah, just talking a little bit. So we've talked a lot about PPI, and I just want to talk a little bit about sort of inclusive research and why it is important and sort of the value of it, really. So, research needs to follow patient and public need, and we know it hasn't historically done that. And we also know that by doing that, it encourages greater involvement and it delivers greater benefits and improves the nation's health and well-being. So it needs to tie in, and it needs to relate, and it needs to be relevant for people across all communities. We know that we need to reach those that are currently underserved by research. And why do we need to reach them? Because we're not hearing from them. And we also know that underserved communities are usually those with the greatest health inequalities, and also those that face the biggest barriers to inclusion and involvement. So they sort of tend to be the worst served by health and care, and lived in the most deprived areas. So there's that real huge burden that they carry of lots of health issues, socioeconomic factors. So really, really important that we are reaching them. And there needs to be an acknowledgement that traditional approaches aren't inclusive. We know that. I think that's a widely accepted thing now. And also not only that they're not inclusive, but actually the way things are set up in the world of research can create barriers for certain communities, and the lack of flexibility sometimes. An example, Amy mentioned it earlier, we have traditionally in PPI, we have patient advisory groups, and that's what's written into the sort of research applications, that we'll have a group or we'll have a co-applicant, and we know that this attracts a certain type of person who needs to be fluent in a certain language and have a certain level of comprehension. So actually, what can we do differently in that? And one of the approaches we've taken in sort of PPI is, instead of having a patient advisory group, we've developed a patient advisory network, which allows a bit more flexibility. It's a bigger group, or it's a bigger network, and it allows people to get involved in different ways. So that's one example. The other is sometimes a lot of meetings are held online. We know digital exclusion is a huge factor for people living in poverty, for different communities for whom English might not be the first language. So therefore, again, that's immediately, if the only way you're engaging with people is is online, then that's going to immediately exclude people. So it's about thinking a little bit more about the approach that you take and putting in that flexibility when you can. And as Amy said earlier, acknowledging there's things that we can't change because that's how it is, but actually where you can make those changes to kind of be thinking about that. And also we say it's important to connect and work with local communities and develop meaningful, sustainable and trusting relationships with them. So we know mistrust is a thing within communities, and that's one of the barriers and factors in terms of working with communities. But actually, if we link in and connect with them through existing mechanisms, and there's lots out there, and close that cycle, as Amy said, not have that parachute in, parachute out approach. We need to be going back. We need to be feeding back to them and keeping them as part of the entire process, rather than sometimes I'm feeling that they've just been used when needed and then we step out and never heard from again. So we need to think about that as well. And there needs to be things need to be developed, co-developed, and we need to provide inclusive, flexible and accessible opportunities. This is about working with those communities and asking them how they'd like to be involved and developing those flexible opportunities that can adapt to different circumstances and different groups. And that kind of approach we know works much, much better than just saying, this is how you can get involved. For example, you can be a co-applicant, or you can join a patient advisory group, or if you're involved in the research, this is the only way of doing it. That immediately isn't going to be inclusive. And if we know co-development, co-design is really important, so involving people right from the start makes them feel more involved and as part of that whole process. And finally, research should be patient-led, and people should be able to get involved in a way that works for them. So I think I've touched upon a bit of this, but it's about it's not about doing to people, it's doing with them, and it's about people feeling that the things that research is focusing on is very much important to them as well, and that motivates people to get involved. And if there's flexibility in how they get involved, then that encourages different groups and communities to be involved. Next one, please. Thanks, Amy. So I'm just going to go through this. So this is something we've developed in Leeds called the Leeds approach to engaging with communities for research. Just to set a bit of context. So I came into this role about probably just over a year ago, and my background is in academia research. My whole background is working with communities. And when I first came in, a lot of the community organisations and groups that I were working with told us that they were getting a lot of requests from researchers across the board who wanted to involve diverse groups and communities. And you have to remember, these are very small organisations that aren't well funded, and we're feeling a little bit overwhelmed with it. And I'm part of a network called the People's Voices Partnership in Leeds, which is a group that comes together of people that work in engagement, involvement, research from statutory and third sector and charities in Leeds. And we decided it would be really good to kind of set a bit of a benchmark and develop some principles around when communities are approached about engaging with research, about research and PPI, that this, I suppose it's a bit of a benchmark, and about this is how we will work with you, just to avoid some of the stuff that I've talked about previously. So we developed this set of principles, and this has been adopted by the organisations that sit on the People's Voices Partnership, which includes like the Hospital Trust, the Mental Health Trust, Leeds City Council, Health Watch, and obviously we were sort of a key partner in writing it, the BRC. So It is available on our website. Sorry, there's not a link in there. And it's been kind of adopted even wider now across Leeds by different research and academic bodies that are wanting to work with communities. So I'll just run through kind of and explain each point as sort of best I can. So key principles. The first is build upon what we know. So this is about avoiding duplication and you know, we always say as an absolute starting point for any kind of engagement or research work is to check if the work's already been done. And this has come about because a lot of community groups have said, we're sick and tired of people coming and asking us the same thing over and over again. We've already told you about our experience of X, Y, and Z. So one of the things that's been developed as part of the People's Voices Partnership is like an insight library of what people are telling us about their experiences. So the expectation is you'd go and look at that first or other things that are available and see if that can inform and support your work, or do you need to go out and ask more? And then we always say work in partnership with anything that's already happening. So that's the first principle. The second, which I've already talked about, is hear the voice of inequalities. And again, this is around when we're approaching communities, make sure that consideration is being given to how the voice of inequalities is going to be included in your research, in your engagement work, in your PPI, in anything that you're doing. And how are you going to carry out that work with those communities in a way that is inclusive and accessible? And how is that going to be resourced and supported as well? So I've said this a few times, and it's an absolute thing about, we say people, groups and communities should be able to be involved in a way that works for them, not in a way that works for us. So that's really, really important. Third point is about recognising and rewarding people for their contributions. And Amy's already talked about this, but we say people, communities and groups should be adequately rewarded for their time and input. A lot of these community groups are tiny community groups that basically are run by volunteers, you know, and goodwill. So therefore, you should be resourcing that input that they put in, whether you make a donation to the group or whether you provide lunch for your session. However it's done, it's about that recognition. Because as Amy said earlier, and I've had this a few times where existing PPI members will say, oh, well, I don't claim expenses and I don't, you know, need this. And I would say, well, it must be great to be in a position where you don't need to do that. But we know certainly when you're working with underserved communities, people are not able to afford to give their time freely or cover their own travel expenses. So it's really, really important that we recognise that. And the feedback to people who've been involved, again, really, really important. You know, make sure that you're feeding back on progress and outcomes to those that have shared their experience, so they know that it's gone somewhere and what's being done with it. And I know in research it is difficult, there's not clear outcomes, it's a long-term thing, but people can still be given updates on progress, and you can outline and share the timescales for feeding outcomes and sharing with them. And the next one, really important, we say work with and alongside community organisations. There's lots and lots of organisations out in the community who are doing this. You don't need to be going in and doing it yourself. You need to use their expertise, and you need to work in partnership with those communities and use those contacts. But also, again, I would say you need to be rewarding and recognising those communities and not be expecting that to be done for free, because a lot of the community organisations are really struggling financially due to cutbacks at the moment. So, you know, if there is funding and resources, then that needs to go that way in return. And in return for that, you will get access to those communities and that real rich information. And always ask people what's important to them. So I would say, even though you're going in with a requirement about a specific piece of research, actually, one of the things we've started doing with our PPI activities is just asking people at the end what's important to them, what matters to them. And hopefully eventually that cycle that builds up and research is then based upon what is important to people. We've also, and it's got to be a two-way relationship. So, you know, when people have told us what's important to them, we've then tried to cater to that and take in maybe researchers and people working in specific areas to answer some of the questions and queries they have. So it's got to be that two-way relationship. And finally, we've built into this the 3 Cs. So this is something that's been developed in the health and social care world in Leeds around always consider the 3 Cs when working with people. And it's communication, coordination, and compassion. And this has come about from lots and lots of work around patient experience, where pretty much the vast majority of the feedback will fall under, that people gave, negative and positive, will fall under one of those 3 areas. So we thought it's really important to build it into this. So in terms of communication, it's about having simple, clear information in different formats that people can understand, communicate with people in a way that works for them, keep people informed and updated as to what's happening. So really good, clear communication. And the coordination is any work that we do should be coordinated and developed in partnership. So we're not all going in doing the same thing over and over again. Wherever possible, I know it's not always possible. And if there's existing opportunities and events for engaging, then those should be utilised to provide that more coordinated approach. And finally, compassion. We should adopt a compassionate approach when working with communities or working with anything, and that should underpin any engagement work that we do. And if we are working in partnership with organisations that support communities, then that would hopefully help support that sort of kind, compassionate approach, which is really, really important in terms of building those long, trusting relationships with those communities, and will enable you to have that better relationship. And also, as Amy sort of preluded to earlier, that if you go in as the University of Leeds and people don't have a good experience, then that tells the whole organisation and makes it difficult for others to then go in and have similar engagement. I think that's it for me, Amy. Sorry, I know I've waffled on a bit. Back to you.
Okay, brilliant.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Sharanjit. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Oh, sorry, Amy. Yeah, you can continue. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Sharanjit. I don't think that was waffle at all. I think that was incredibly helpful. So I am sort of conscious of time, and we want to make sure we've got some time for questions. So I won't talk through these in length. They're all there in the slides for you to refer back to. But there's various different resources and support across the trust, the university, the NIHR, that can help you with PPI. I've also included our contact details there if you want to get in touch. I appreciate that this has been a real whistle-stop tour of covering both PPI and research inclusion, so you may have more questions than when you came into this. So by all means, do reach out to any one of us if you want to speak about this in more detail, about sort of any queries you've got or any projects that you might be working on. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand back to you now.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy and Sharanjit, for a wonderful talk, about how to embed PPIE, in our research in general. And as you always do, you always learn something new and some more buzzwords. So initially all about patient advisory group, and now we have a patient advisory network. So that will lead to our first question, actually. So from Sarah Williams. So she would like to hear more about patient advisory network. So how did people sign up for this network, and what are sort of activities that were carried out via the network? I think she's thinking more about, to think about the different ways of involving people. So for example, if they do have like a neurodivergent person who may not be necessarily comfortable with the PPIE group setting, but how can we involve them in the network, as such?
Do you want to take that one, Sharanjit?
Yeah, I was going to say, do you want me to go on that one? So, because I suppose I kind of started that one. Yeah, so we're trying it out with a big study that we're putting an application for the moment, and we did it in the development phase. And all it is it's called a network, and it just gives absolute flexibility for people to dip in and out how they wish. And what we do as part of the patient advisory network is we still have meetings that people can come to who choose to, who want to, but actually if somebody wants to input in a different way, they can do. So like one of the meetings we had was just looking at the plain English version of the research grant document, and some people are really up for that, and it's not other people's cup of tea, and that's absolutely fine. But somebody wanted to input, so we emailed it to them and they shared their feedback. We can have conversations. So it's about sort of saying to people, you can be a part of this, but you don't have to come to every single thing and input into every single part of it. We did a more interactive workshop earlier on around getting some ideas for something, and different people found that useful and came to that. So it's just, yeah, it's about sort of having flexibility. And I suppose with me being in post and being linked and connected to lots of different communities, we can do that. It might be slightly more challenging when you don't have that support to be able to do that. So yeah, it's I always say sort of doing the inclusive stuff, and if I'm being absolutely honest, it's more work. It presents different challenges, and in a way it's almost easier to get a small patient advisory group, tick that box, get a few people, and if that's just what you want to do. But actually, if you really want to be inclusive and do it, then you've got to put the work in to get the outputs that you need at the end. Does that answer the question? I don't know if you want to add anything, Amy.
I don't think I've got anything to add to that.
Okay, good. So what we'll just go because we've got 2 minutes left. So so if we can get short answer as well for 2 questions. So one regarding the Insight Library, because I'm really interested in this as well as we all here. So like we say, we don't want to duplicate things in the communities. So please let us know if you have started to pull this together and what materials or media it includes and where it is kept and is accessible to researchers.
So this is the People's Voices partnership that I've started to pull it together, and it started off, it's not the world of research, it's the world of engagement and involvement about reports that they had done on people's experiences. It's being pulled together at the moment. It's in the early stages and it's reliant on people uploading, but the plan is it eventually becomes a public site that people can access and can see different pieces of engagement. And there's still very early conversations about how we bring the world of research into that, because it would then just become another huge library. But I suppose what it would give you is that public and patient insight and experience. So it's in progress.
Brilliant. And we've got one final question, maybe for Amy. So I think about 2 people were agreeing to some questions. So they were asking about, are you planning or are you already collecting demographic data for those involved in research studies? Just because they are looking to, for research teams in the BRC to capture this data for participants. Yeah, so do you have any answer for that, Amy?
Yeah, so I think there's probably 2 sides to that. There's collecting demographics for participation, and there's collecting demographics for involvement and engagement activities. And they probably require different approaches, to be perfectly honest. I imagine if you're going to be doing that around participation, there probably needs to be more of a institution-wide approach to that, to make sure that it's consistent throughout. I imagine with PPI, you can probably be more flexible in terms of how you approach people for that. I think one of the key things to consider with that is sort of like, if you're going to be asking for demographic data from people, you always need to give people the option to prefer not to say. And also to note that prefer not to say and people not answering the question aren't the same thing. They're two different things as well. And I think, Sharanjit, you probably gave me the best piece of advice about this as well, is like, just ask people if they're happy to complete an equality form, and explain to them really clearly as to why you're asking them to do it as well. And I think sometimes you see practices where people will be like, oh, this is really long if we cover all the different questions in this area. But actually, I suppose if you remove ones where you think they're not relevant, then you're making that decision about whether that's relevant to people's experiences or not. And we really shouldn't be doing that. So I think it probably can't be an all or nothing approach to it. That's my personal opinion, and probably a bit more waffly than necessary. But I'm just going to go and have a look for a link. I think it's for Daisy Framework or something like that, but it's a really good link which talks about different equality monitoring questions and how to approach that. Sharanjit, do you have anything to add to that at all?
No, I think that's fine. And yeah, I was just thinking that link, I think it is Daisy. We can send that through. That'll be helpful, I think.
Okay, brilliant. So I think we got to close the meeting. So before we end, I'm just gonna show again. There you go. So this is the QR code for the survey. So we'll be grateful to hear from you, to see, what went really good, what can we improve, and also what are the topics that you would like us to include in the next seminar series, because this is all, for you all learning as well. And also just to save the dates again, so our next series will be on funding opportunities on the 4th of March. And also the following that will be tips on successful grant writing on the 19th of March. So the adverts will come shortly in February. So again, I would just like to thank you so much to Amy and Sharanjit. Your talks were amazing, and I keep on mesmerized and learning all something new, like every day. You all, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. And yeah, so have a nice day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.